these are land-associated creatures, and you can have a broad spectrum in there, all the way from possibly insects, all the way to larger animals. Those that are probably smaller, including probably most small mammals, including worms even. So animals that are close to the ground, that creep. In fact, you could even translate it, he created creepers that creep, is a literal translation of the text. So quite a variety of animals would be included in that broad category. Then the third category are those that are probably most distant from man, which would include all of the wild animals. Lions, tigers, elephants, you name it. Quite a variety that you can think of in that category. So these categories are probably more in relationship to man rather than strictly biological categories. Does that make sense? In fact, that's probably true of the other categories that we've looked at as well, in terms of their usefulness in relationship to man. And one thing that we can see immediately is, again, we have a striking difference, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but we could spend as much time as we did earlier stressing the inconsistency with the biblical account and all naturalistic theories. And just a point here, mammals and reptiles on the same day. And obviously the evolutionary scheme, you have billions of years in between. And the sequence is out of sequence as well. And I use this chart throughout, and just to point out the inconsistency, and I'm just going to do it real quickly here again, in terms of day 5 and in terms of day 6. So in the Genesis account, you have fruit trees with seed already. So these are advanced trees. And notice they're before insects. And most seed-bearing plants are dependent on insects for pollination. And yet it's not probably until day 6 that we have insects. You may have maybe some on day 5. So a great inconsistency in terms of the evolutionary thought or naturalistic thought. Aquatic life, again, inconsistent. Flying creatures, birds in the evolutionary scheme are much later, very late. It takes a lot of evolution to create, according to them, a flying creature. And remember, we stressed when we talked about flying creatures, there has to be 4 distinct evolutionary movements, because we have 4 distinct creatures that fly. We have reptilian flying creatures, we have mammals that fly, bats, they're mammals. We have insects that fly, and then we have what we commonly refer to as birds, as flying creatures. So totally inconsistent with evolution. Dinosaurs are probably created on day 5. The point being is there's no consistency here. So you can't combine the biblical account without doing great damage to the text of Scripture. That's why we take it literally and take it naturally, and basically say that evolutionary theory just does not have a biblical basis whatsoever, and I believe it doesn't have a scientific basis as well. So just to complete this chart here, wild animals, early in evolutionary thinking, the last of God's creation in the Genesis account, and then man is the last one. So we have the revelation, and God said, and God articulates the specific 3 categories. And then, as we see in all of the days, and it was so. The immediacy of fulfillment, another contradiction with evolutionary thinking. I'm not stressing that tonight, but you see it over and over and over. And it was so. In other words, not after billions of years, not after millions of years, and it was so. In other words, completion on day 6. And then we have reiteration of what God announces or articulates in verse 24. And God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and notice it's in reverse order. And the cattle, this kind of stresses, this is all instantaneous, this is all at the same time. There's not a progression here, there's not evolutionary time. But just to kind of show you, he reverses the order here. Not because this is the order that they were created, but I think he creates all three categories at the same time. Okay? So after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind, and God saw that it was good. That's the divine evaluation. There's no survival of the fittest. There's no death. There's no progress, evolutionary progress. It was all good, and God saw that it was good. He announced the goodness of it. It was good, and then he'll complete that in verse 31. So that's the creation of the first part of day 6. So you have the assessment. You have some of these elements in every one of the creative days to reiterate the work that God accomplished. Now, we also, just kind of as a concluding note here, in terms of the Babylonian account of creation is in Enuma Elish. That's the descriptive term for it. Comes from Nineveh, found in the Ashurbanipal library. That account of creation does not give very much attention to the specific creative acts that we have in Genesis here. It primarily deals with creation of heavenly, or not, I shouldn't say heavenly, astral bodies and universe and those sort of things. It tends to neglect the things that we have in the book of Genesis. So you do have a lot of inconsistencies with the Babylonian account, even though there's some parallels there. And by the way, that was a photograph or a sketch of a portion of the archaeological find there. So on day 6, we have the creation of land animals, and we have the creation of man, which we'll devote the rest of our time here. So let's take a look at that. Again, we have the creative words of God, and God said. But we have a very striking contrast. We have a shift in the articulation. In fact, we could describe it as a divine contemplation or a divine conversation that goes on. This is very unique in the creation of man. So it's already alerting us to the idea that this is going to be distinct, this is going to be separate, this is going to be something very special. This is what all of the other days are preliminary towards. And what we have now is this conversation or this contemplation going on. And let's take a look at that and see what is in view there. So we have in verse 26, then God said, "Let us make man in our image." We didn't have that before. It just says, "Let there be," or "Let the earth bring forth," or "Let so-and-so happen." But now we have this divine conversation, contemplation, "Let us." Well, what's going on here? Now, the concept that we think of in terms of what's going on here, I think lays a foundation for the rest of what Scripture will develop in some detail. So I think this is very, very important and crucial that we understand what's going on. Now, historically, there have been different approaches as to how to take these personal pronouns. Who do they refer to? Well, it appears clearly God is speaking, as He has throughout the creation account. But why are they in the plural? Well, there's a couple of things that we have in view here. This plural idea, but also this personal involvement. So we have two aspects that are distinct and separate. We had before, "Let the earth bring forth these land animals." Now we have personal action. And not only personal action, but a plurality involved here. Well, what is in view? And there are a variety of interpretations or suggestions as to what's going on here. And let me just give you some of them. In fact, there's probably at least 20 of them if you read several commentaries. Some of them very far out, by the way. Well, some think that it's an allusion. In fact, this would be the liberal perspective. It's an allusion to what they would say polytheistic roots in Israel. And then Israel eventually became monotheistic. But these would be hints of that background and those roots, because there is a plurality here in terms of the speaker, who is God. But I think that's totally inconsistent with the rest of what Scripture teaches. Secondly, some would suggest that it's Yahweh or God speaking with angelic beings. The problem with that view is if in fact angelic beings are in view, nowhere do we have in Scripture the teaching that angels were involved in God's creation. In fact, we have almost the opposite. We have them as observers and praising God for what He did. And no one participates. In fact, the creative act is a unique divine activity that no one participates in, including angelic beings. So we would reject that view. Some suggest that it's just some divine counsel. Well, who's He counseling? The only beings to counsel would be angelic beings. So this is similar to the second viewpoint. A common viewpoint is the fullness of God's attributes are in view here, or the fullness of God speaking. In a way, we would agree with that, but I think it goes beyond that concept. It's not just God's attributes. Fifthly, a majestic viewpoint, God in His majesty. This is the common Jewish interpretation. Jews historically have viewed this as an indication of the majesticness of God, the greatness of Him. You can't refer to Him solely as singular, so He's referred to in a majestic way in the plural. Not suggesting the next one, which I would believe is the one that we would hold to. I think what we have in this passage is the fullness of God Himself. Now, be careful, it doesn't teach explicitly the Trinity. Now, the rest of the Scripture develops this concept of the multiplicity of the nature of God. Even the Old Testament. In fact, we've already had hints of that in Genesis chapter 1. We had a hint of that, Bereshit Elohim bara. We have the hint of a plurality there. Elohim is a what kind of a noun? Those of you that know Hebrew, that's a plural noun. And yet, bara, in the same context, is what kind of a verb? Create. It's a singular. So we have this is inconsistent Hebrew grammar. It's not incorrect, because it accurately describes what's going on here. But what it does, it tells us, is that God is at least a plurality. There's a multiplicity to the nature of God. So a multiple God, if you will. Maybe that's not a good description. Multiplicity in the Godhead, probably a better way of phrasing that. And yet viewed as a single entity as well, single essence. So it hints at what the New Testament develops in terms of a full-blown concept of the Trinity.